Hello, welcome to Speech Talk Live, episode number 17. My name is Jay Oza, and I'm the host of this show. And today we have Julie Finkelstein from Connecticut and Latesh Balakrishna from Mumbai. And the purpose of this show is, as the title indicates, it's to discuss public speaking and speaking in general. And we are kind of loosely associated with the Coursera's course called Introduction to Public Speaking. Uh, we do things here a little differently because that course is very academic. It's taught by Dr. McGarity from University of Washington, and he does a fantastic job teaching about public speaking. What we tend to do here is take a little bit of a non-academic approach in how do you actually use public speaking in real life. And we have created this community learning cohort on Google+, and our purpose is we have four objectives. One is to learn, because public speaking is an ongoing thing. You're never really an expert, I don't believe. Second is to teach. Some of us have been doing this for quite some time now, and Julie and Latesh have been doing this show now with me for close to 3-4 months now. And prior to that, they've also taken the public speaking course, so they know quite a bit about public speaking. But they're also a student, just like me. The third thing is to share. We also record our speeches and get feedback. Feedback is very important on both sides, learning to give feedback and learning to receive feedback. That's an ongoing thing that we all have to learn. And the last thing is to support. This is a show and the forum where we support each other, because this is where the stakes are non-existent, but you have to raise the stakes yourself to make it so. Otherwise, it's not going to improve. You're not going to improve. So that's the objective. But we're not going to put any pressure on you. It's completely up to you. But then you got to up the game, because when you go out in the real world, where the stakes are going to be high, where you're going to have to do a great job. So this is where you get to practice. And if you practice like it's real, then when you do it in the real world or in a real situation, you won't feel any pressure, and you'll ace it. All right. So at this point, I will let Julie, and before we start, I always tend to forget this. I'm based out of Hazlet, New Jersey, which is about 45 miles from New York City. And today, I don't know if you know, New York City is a real mess. We have not mess because of this person, but they had to close down a lot of streets. The Pope is in New York City today, so it's really hectic there. I don't know who's traveling there, but definitely there's no point in bringing cars to New York City this weekend, actually. Today's show is going to be on, again, the theme is on story. We covered this in the past, but I think we need to spend more time, and I don't think even 1 hour is going to be sufficient, but we're going to take a deep dive into stories, look at it all sides, why it works, what makes it work, and how it could be used to manipulate people. So that's the theme. So at this point, I'll have Julie and Latesh do a quick introduction, and then, as usual, we started something. We're going to do you have 3 minutes to give a talk on any topic of your choosing. All right. So Julie, you want to go next?
Yes. So this is just a quick introduction, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So my name is Julie. I moved from Chicago to Stanford, and before that was Canada, and before that was Hong Kong and China. So right now I'm very interested in public speaking, because I find that the course, along with the support of my colleagues and my study buddies, I have really learned to feel more confident about speaking, and also to be able to analyze and be more convincing, or at least more clear in my communications. So I found this to be extremely useful, and I'm grateful for being a student here and a mentor. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go next. So, hi everyone. My name is Latesh Balakrishna. I'm based out from India, and specifically this week I'm based out from Mumbai. I work in the software industry as a project manager. My hobbies are running, fitness-related activities, and reading, etc. I use this platform and for getting plenty of opportunities to do public speaking. And using this platform, it has been really helpful for me to improve in all these skills. So I have been trying to practice, and I have been actually practicing this even in my work. And I try to use these skills wherever possible, even in public forums or in general seminars, etc. So these skills which I learned here comes in very handy. So thank you very much, Jay.
Okay, thanks, Latesh. I think everybody did a great job, kept it under 30 seconds. All right, so the next segment is, this is something that we started doing, I think a few episodes ago, where each of us gets up to 3 minutes. Now, if you go a little bit over, we're not going to cut you off or anything, we're not doing that. But the reason is that, the reason I say 3 minutes is because that's about all the time you're ever going to get. People after 3 minutes are going to just zone out, or you become a bore. So 3 minutes is the mark that I've come up with, and obviously if you can do it less than that, that's even better. 2 minutes is fine, so there's no limit, but between like a little bit more than a minute and less than 3 minutes. So I'll kick this off, and today I want to talk about something that we covered in one of the episodes, and this had to do with, if you remember, this professor from UCLA, Albert Mehrabian. And he said that when you are speaking, the way an audience perceives your speech, the 55% of the communication is through your body language, how you move, the gestures, the way you move your head, everything. That's how people perceive, that's how their understanding, your communication is taking place through, 55% is through body language. 38% is how you use your voice, intonation, pauses, how you control your voice, that communicates 38%. And then the words is approximately 7%. Now, if you try to explain that to somebody, they're going to get confused. They're going to say, whoa, what does that number mean? Like what? Like I have to 55% use my body and I only should use 7% words or something like that. It gets very hard to explain that, and you end up spending more time explaining it. So I had to do that just a couple of days ago, and I was explaining it to somebody, and the person didn't get it. So I try to simplify it, and this kind of goes into what we're talking about with a story. So I said, okay, here's how you understand it. If you see a nice car, what really you're seeing is a body of the car. That's what's really impressing you. Like, wow, that's a nice looking car. But the car isn't moving, so it doesn't do anything. It's just sitting there parked somewhere. But then the person gets in the car and pops up the engine, and you hear the engine going boom, 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 and suddenly you're like, wow, that car sounds good. So far you got two things. The body looks good, the car sounds good, but still the car isn't moving. And that's where you need the gas. And until the car has sufficient gas, the car isn't going to be moving. So I said, this Mehrabian formula can be applied directly to a car, where you can see a car moving. If you want to go from point A to point B, you need to move. The body is what you're going to see, but you still have an engine underneath it that you're not really going to see. But there is also a lot of gas that's needed for that car to get there. Without that, it doesn't work. So it's not like you can split this off into 55, 38, 7. They all working together, but your eyes always tend to see the body moving. And that's why I believe that this formula, I don't know if it's exactly 55, 38, 7, but if you look at it in real life, in anything, that's how we perceive things. But the gas every time is the words. The words are not just something that are totally meaningless. So don't think that the words don't matter. They matter a lot. It's just that that's not how we perceive things. Anyway, so that's how I explained it, and I think the person got it. So, Julie, you're next.
Thanks, Jay. Today I thought I would stay in alignment with the storytelling aspect, and what I heard from all three speakers was that storytelling is a basic human experience, human construct, and it's deeply embedded our neural structure. And so the 3 layers of sandwich, the top layer is the neurocortex, our rational brain. The mid-level is our mammalian brain, and the emotions are kind of there. And um, that is what they connect to give us meaning. And so each of the stories in their own way is saying, go below the rational brain, go into the emotional brain. And they talk about dopamine is giving you the pleasure feeling, and that is our evolutionary drive for survival and evolution. And finally, the reptilian brain is the survival brain. And that has the ability to hijack all our energy. And so in each of the stories, they kind of use that current neural model. So I want to just, in terms of structure, I want to add a bleeding edge or leading edge idea is that actually our gut is our first level of contact with reality. And current neuroscience shows that before we even are aware of the thoughts, 50 seconds, 1/50th of a thousandth of a second, that decision is already in our brain. So before we're conscious, it's already happened. And those neurochemicals they're talking about, such as serotonin and dopamine, they come from the gut. So the ancient studies of like trust your gut, which actually not that ancient, because during my career as an IT person, that was one of the practices that we were engaging in. So I just want to say that in looking at our neural structures, yes, our emotional brains are there, our survival brains are there, our rational brains are there. And each of the storytellers tell us to see the power of the story, to use it as a tool, and to go beyond the story. Because one of the stories is that the stories simplify our lives. But sometimes life is at the edges, the messes, the boundaries, going beyond the box. So what he suggested to do is to do hovering, which is essentially what meditation does. It lets you hover at the edge of reality. So the meditational system that is being very old actually taps into our 4 brains or 5 brains, our gut, our reptilian brain, our mammalian brain, and our rational brain. So I just want to say that, and that's a context I want to give. So thank you.
Yeah, that's good. I think we're going to cover more of that later. So I'm sure you're going to expand upon that further. So Latesh, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So, Julie, that was a good talk, especially straight from the gut. So, for me, like, I'm already hungry, so I don't know how my thoughts are going to come out. I hope my dopamine is set properly. Well, so today I'm going to talk about telecommuting or work from home. So, in other words, it's also called teleworking. So that's the topic that I'm going to discuss about. So this is a concept that is relatively new in this part of the globe. I mean, it's been there for some time, but it's something that is not being practiced across the companies or the organizations. So to give you a context, so technology has really broken all the barriers. I mean, there is no geographical divide that's actually there when we have a technological landscape in place. So with that context, it becomes fairly simple to ease the work-life balance. So what happens is, like, when we are giving employees the flexibility of working from home, that gives them a lot of advantages to balance their work life, and it has a lot of potential to increase their productivity as well. In fact, it has been found that employees who are given this kind of flexibility are having a reduced absenteeism in work. The productivity has drastically increased. In fact, there is overtime that happens. The employee model is like completely high. And in fact, the stress level also, because they're having good work-life balance, the stress level also goes down drastically. So with this kind of an advantages, this concept is going to stay. But it may not be applicable across all the industries. But those which have a connection with technology or where your physical presence is not really needed at the workplace, probably this is a very good concept to use. Now, majority of the employers here in India are like just about they're trying to use this kind of a practice and see how it works out. But it's still in the very initial phases, and the concept is something that the older generation is finding it a bit difficult to get up to speed. Like, what exactly? How would you be doing the work? How will this particular concept make sure that the work that is assigned is getting done properly, where the employees are not misusing this particular practice for doing some other activity during the work hours. So those kind of these are some sort of factors which are probably working against this concept in this part of the globe. But given the, I think the solution could be like to bring about a mix of both the working from home as well as giving the flexibility to be at office at like not really say 8 hours or 9 hours of clocking, but probably 4 hours or 5 hours of clocking. Something like that will mix it up with the work from home concept. Probably that gives a right flavor for the employers as well as the employees to give justice to this particular protocol. With that, I would say that with the technological landscape improving a lot, with Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat, really gives up a lot of insights into this. So with this kind of a scenario, this kind of generation, which really loves freedom, this concept is going to stay, and it is for the employers, it is for the industry to embrace this concept. Thank you.
Yeah, Latesh, that was excellent. I would like you to expand upon that and make that into a speech, because there's a lot you can cover for that. 3 minute was excellent. So when I look at a 3-minute speech, both you and Julie, what I want is, I want to know more. That's the main thing, right? Because you're not going to give them a long speech and bore them, because you want to get some feedback. So both of you did so well was that I want to know more about how the brain works when it comes to processing stories, the way Julie explained. So then the next thing is, yes, I want to know more. So that's the kind of feedback you want from your audience. Is that 3 minute? Is that giving the other person? Is that getting that person, whetting that person's interest? And then that gives you an idea. Oh, okay, so I did get my point across really well in 3 minutes. And the same thing. This telecommuting 3-minute talk you gave, I would like to know more about it. There are a lot of aspects that you can cover. So just to give you a little feedback that that was an effective 3-minute talk. And the main thing I'm trying to get from when I listen to a 3-minute talk is that I would like to know more about it. So that's what you have to do when you're doing a 3-minute talk. So I thought that was really well done. The only thing I'll point out to you now that you did whet my interest is I do telecommute, right? But I have a different take on that. Is that what I like to do is that this is a hybrid model. That if there is a way you can find an office space, like even one room, which is different from outside your home, I find that to be more effective. So you feel like you're going to work, yet you're very close to your home. So if you got issues where you have to go home, go for lunch or something, you're not, because sometimes home you need a change. I find that I do need a change to go from home to another place, then I can come back. So I feel like relaxed that way. This way I can focus on work and not have to worry about, because sometimes home can be very distracting too. So that's something that I just wanted to let you know, that we could have a bigger discussion on telecommuting. All right, so at this point I'm going to take a brief pause, and we'll get started with our first segment. Okay, welcome back. My name is Jay Oza, to Speech Talk Live, episode number 17, and we're moving to segment number 1. And in this segment, we're going to look at story. Story from a much broader angle. Why do stories work? What's about the story? Why should you consider even using a story? And why it is so effective in communicating your message to somebody. And for this particular speech, we used a video of a woman by the name of Lisa Cron, and she gave a TED Talk called Wired for Story. And what she's saying in this video is that that's how our brain has been wired from the beginning. That's how we're wired. We basically know how to understand something through stories. That's how we've done it through ages. And if you think about it, she's got a point there, that that's how religion has spread over the years, right? Before people could actually write down some of the great religions, whether it's Hinduism, Christianity, the way they were able to get people to understand some of the lessons that were being taught was through stories. So that's how we've been brought up through ages. And if you look at all religions, it's got the strong part is the story. Story is the main part of all the religions. And in fact, people go and listen to a preacher. In India, they have these, I don't know if they're called swamis, but they give talks on Mahabharata and Ramayana, and it is really, their power is in the way they tell those stories. That's what people are just moved by them. They'll go and listen to this for days and days and days because these epic poems are really long, and they'll sit through like 9 days to listen to Mahabharata and Ramayana. And the same thing happens, like people in the U.S., they go to churches, and the preacher is telling the lesson isn't, the lesson is simple, but to explain that so that people can remember it is the power, is the story, the way they can tell the story to the people, the congregants who are attending. There's one thing, I know you guys have lots, I don't want to take up too much of time, and there's one thing I'll point out that she does in this speech, and she talks about how stories have been influential, the role that stories have played in changing history. And she cites this book, Harper Lee's book called To Kill a Mockingbird. And what she says is that that book kind of showed about how African Americans were mistreated in the South. And what Harper Lee's book did was it raised the awareness slowly, so that people started understanding that they were not treated fairly, even though slavery had ended after Lincoln, after Civil War, but still African Americans, there was that separation that existed, and they were not treated well. And that book, in that case, it had to do with justice, how this one African American male was tried for rape and then was sent to jail, and I think he was, I don't remember the details of it, and he ended up dying in jail. And that kind of showed people about the injustices that existed in the South. There were two other books that she does not mention that I'll just briefly mention that also had a real influence in changing history. One was a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and this book came out before the Civil War. It was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and that helped get rid of slavery. And in fact, Abraham Lincoln once said to Harriet Beecher Stowe that you're the woman, who has caused all this, problem, and as a joke. And in a way, that book was highly influential. Still today, even though we don't have slavery, but there is slavery that still exists in the world. And the third book I'll mention also had a real big impact on changing the way people viewed things. And it was a book written by a woman named, it's interesting, all these three books are written by women. I just noticed it, was Rachel Carson. And Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring. And here she was showing how effect that pesticide was having on the environment. And that book kind of created the modern environmental movement. I think that book must have come out in the early 60s. And prior to that, there were really not much focus on pesticides that people were just dumping in the ground and would get into water. It would cause all kinds of, sickness and birth defects, all kinds of problems that caused. And that book kind of focused on that we had to be very careful with what was being with all these pesticides in the air, in the water, and in the food. And to this day, I think when Al Gore came out with his, I forgot his, he had come out with this movie, and I think at that time he brought attention to this book, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. So the point is that stories are extremely important, not in communicating your message, but they're important in changing history. So I think I agree with what Lisa Cron is saying, that that has a lot to do with how our brains are wired. Julie, you want to expand on that further? You're muted. You have to unmute your phone.
Wow. Okay. So you saw my body language. So today I want to look at the meta aspect of speaking, and so I'm looking at the. I'm very interested in timing, as you know. So I'm looking at the introduction and the conclusion, how much time they were used, and also the transition from the introduction into the main point, and then the transition to conclusion. So this young lady spent about almost 5 minutes in the introduction, and she spent about 2 or 3 minutes in the conclusion. So that's almost more than a third, less than a half in that margin. And her basic message was stories are powerful, they're hardwired, and then at the end, in the conclusion, she says, feel the impact, respond mindfully, and use the power of story as a tool. Never underestimate it and use it wisely. So how did she go from the beginning to this? She started off with friendly gestures of her own experience, and she really actually didn't go into the topic except to use that as a transition point. And at the transition point, she says, stories are hardwired, and they affect the way we behave. So she used examples of her belief system, her core belief system, and then she showed that she demonstrated that her behavior was different. So used the personal stories in all 3 cases. At the end, she transitioned into how you can do it by those 2 sentences. So the story was very speaker-centric. But if you look at it, basically 5 minutes for introduction, using this personal story as transition points, using the different messages, and then the conclusion is where she shared her experience. I find it very interesting that almost half of the time was used for introduction and conclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, that was good. Latesh, do you have any comment on? I mean, approach it from not only from the speech. You can comment on the speech itself, but overall, as a story, what she's talking, the content, and then you can focus on specific to her speech giving.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Jay. Lisa Cron, for me, when she started off with the talk, as Julie mentioned, she was actually discussing and giving the introduction a lot. I think there are some talk which would pull you to listen to the subject, to the topic, and there are some where you need to take the patience and you need to make yourself heard. You need to make yourself press yourself so that you are able to listen to what the author is trying to convey. So from that angle, I felt that there was a slight disconnect because there was a lot of words. The number of words which she was using was like phenomenal, and it was like very fast-paced talk. So from that angle, I didn't feel it like it was helping me to really get the concept that she was trying to say. It kind of many things went over my head. But yeah, for me, from the angle of her content, it was really like a lot of personal experiences which she spoke about how stories can be compared. Like she gave the example like when her house was really in a bad state, it was quite untidy, and she was trying to pretend that she was not home when a neighbor came knocking. So, and then she says that this is because she always considers like her house should be the best, like what we see in normal TV ads. sitcoms and normal movies, etc. Like how we see the best things, very tidy, very nicely decorated, and she realizes that her life is now getting guided by something that is more glamour driven, which is something that she sees in somewhere else. Basically, that is bombarded to her mind so much of this world of make believes. And that's like kind of a stories. That's a kind of a storytelling impact that she had on her life. So she says that see, we always learns from our mistakes or past. It's like either you run away from the past or you learn from it or run from it, and that's what she had used. That's a nice statement that I actually liked as a takeaway from this particular talk. So past hurts, either you learn from it or you run from it. And she gave the concept. I mean, she gave the civil rights movement. She brought it out very nicely through the book written by Anne Scott, and wherein this lady was able to really, through the powerful media of storytelling, she was really able to make people feel the change rather than making people understand what the change is all about. So changing the thinking of people by making them aware of how to feel it. So that part really came out very nicely in this. And in terms of stories, she says that it is about giving the context, triggering a lot of emotions in people, and silently guiding our actions through it. So she says that story rules her life, and it transforms a lot of activities. So in fact, when I compare to that, even to my daily life, in fact, during my childhood and all, my uncles and all used to tell me stories. So I used to really enjoy, listening to those stories, because it's like maybe a different world. It's a kind of different curiosity. It triggers some kind of emotions, and maybe it's some kind of neurological activities that happens that she rightly said. So that feel good factor when you hear something which is like, and if it comes through some kind of narrative, and it takes and some kind of learnings, and it gives you a feel good factor, which really makes that the real world worries to go away, and you experience something different. So I enjoyed the concept what she said probably, but it could have been presented in a more maybe in a more slowed pace, and maybe she could have been a bit more there was no connect with the audience. It probably could have brought in some more arousal factor to listen to the entire speech. Thanks. That's
Yeah, no, that's a good point you make. Here's I'll say for her on her defense, is that TED Talks have a pretty strict formula that a speech cannot be more than 18 minutes, and this is a very content-rich speech. I mean, if you go through it, I listened to it multiple times, so it's really, like, my analysis is kind of based on viewing the speech probably 3-4 times, and also I've been doing some research on this whole topic. And when I look at her speech, because I've heard her give a lengthy interview, like a podcast, where she's talking for 1 hour, and she's very interesting to listen to. This woman loves to talk, and she really is an expert on stories, and she really knows the power. But she's so passionate about this particular topic that I really came away learning a lot. There's one thing that I don't think she covers in this speech, which I just want to cover here quickly, that 50% or maybe even more of stories that we listen to have this common structure that's known as the dramatic arc. I don't know if you ever heard of that. It kind of goes like this, toot, 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 like that, right? And it has 5 parts to it. Most of the stories you'll ever come across will have the following structure, where in the beginning they call it the exposition, where you set up the scene, the characters, and the problem, right? Then there is that rising action, like something is taking place, something is happening. Then it reaches a climax at the top, right? So you're going up and it reaches a climax. Then there is that falling action, and then you have the resolution. Most stories pretty much have that structure. That is the standard structure of a story. If you go through any religious stories or any movies, that's the story that we immediately get it. That's what the story we want to see. And the other point that I'll make here is the power of stories. And this has to do with, I think she mentions it in her talk, that stories can be positive and stories can be used for negative purposes, depending on how you look at the situation. And some of it is quite obvious. And just looking at today's situation, the two things that come to mind is in here in the United States this week we have the Pope. Pope tells stories like he gave a speech to the Congress yesterday where he brought in 4 people that he used to tell a story. One was Abraham Lincoln, the other one was Martin Luther King, third one was a social activist named Dorothy Day, and the fourth one was someone named Thomas Merton. I don't know much about him, but I believe he had to do with like having dialogue with people. You got to talk to people. I have to do research on it, but that's what I believe he's famous for. And he used these 4 people to tell a story on what good we can do to people. On the other hand, you have ISIS. ISIS are also very good at telling stories. Their stories is to get people to do some of the worst things to other people, killing people, chopping people's head off, all kinds of stuff. But the common thing they do have is that they're able to do all that. If you ever watch ISIS video, they are very compelling. They're telling a very compelling story, and obviously it's working because people from all over the world are willing to just drop everything. A lot of these young people are from from good families. They're in school, they're willing to drop everything and join the cause. And that just wouldn't happen unless there was a story that just resonated with them. Somehow it appealed to them. And so they're also extremely powerful in telling story. So unless you have a better story that can get somebody to really feel for you, you're not going to be successful. So you have to figure out what is that story that's going to get your message across. Sometimes it's not even the message. The story is sometimes more important and more powerful than the message itself, even though you do need a message, but the message is not really that complicated. But the story has to be that compelling story in that structure that I just mentioned, that people immediately can see it, and it gets them to do all kinds of good things and even some terrible things. Julie, any closing thoughts?
No, I appreciate you saying that the story has to be very compelling. So I also like I find the 5 phases of the storytelling very interesting. I'm just wondering if that's true for the Asian art of storytelling, because like in music, the Western music has all those 5 movements, right? But the Asian story sometimes can be just a single tone. So
yeah, you'd have to get an example. We can cover that next when we talk about storytelling in business, because some of those stories in business do have to be a little different. So we can touch upon that next. But overall, based on the people who most religious stories tend to follow the same dramatic arc. Whether it's Bible, whether it's Hindu text, they all tend to follow the same structure. I'm sure even Islam, the stories are very similar. There is always somebody that there is that initial, there's a challenge out there that somebody faces, and then there's a climax, then there is a change that has taken place, and then the resolution. And I think that arc is a pretty standard. According to somebody, if you look at Hollywood, I'm sure the Bollywood movies are almost like 80% like that. More than 50% of the stories follow that structure. That's what, whether it's movies, TV shows, or anything, where that's what we understand. and the only thing difference is the setting is different, the plot may be different, the characters are different, but the structure remains the same. And in Bollywood, for example, that may even be much higher if that structure. And Latesh can comment more on that since I haven't seen a Bollywood movie in a while.
I agree. Storytelling is like very powerful. I mean, that's what even Lisa has been conveying through her speech. So that's really. I mean, she has brought in actually the comparison between the real world actual scene and what happens when we are, given so much of glamour. I mean, we are given so much of good pictures of all good bad things, which is like it looks like the best in the class, etc. But then the reality is something probably we need to understand that and accordingly, make our feelings, make our lifestyle according to what could be practical, rather than going by stories or being influenced by them. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Just before we move on, I agree with Julie. I like the way she concludes her speech when she I like the way she does that. Like here, she talks about the story, and then she tells us the three things where she says, learn to sense if you are in a sway of a good story, that surge of empowerment. Then she says, learn to master the tools of storytelling, and then she says, third thing, she's never underestimate the power of story. I like the way that she concludes that after she has given us all these examples and sets that all up. Her conclusion is very powerful in this particular speech. Okay, at this point, we're going to move on, take a quick break, and then move on to our next segment. Okay, welcome to Speech Talk Live, episode number 17. We're moving to segment number 2. And in this segment, today the theme of this episode is on story. This segment, we're going to look at a speech that was given by Steve Denning. And Steve Denning is an economist who worked at World Bank. And he came up with something interesting. And I read about this. His actually had an article in Harvard Business Review that he wrote in 2004 titled Telling Tales, where he describes what he's describing in this particular speech. And a little backdrop, because what he is talking about is that that traditional Julie, can you mute your line, please? Thanks.
Like what?
Mute. I can hear the background noise.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was.
Oh, that's okay, no problem. Yeah, so what Steve Denning is talking about it is this traditional dramatic arc story is one kind of story, but that story may not work in a business environment for a number of reasons that he talks about in this speech. So it's not good enough sometimes. We always see, this is the reason I included this particular speech is, and in the next one by Tyler Cowen, is that we always tend to simplify things and saying, hey, you need a good story, you need a good story. And I agree, you do need a good story. But what Steve Denning is saying, you need the right story, because good story isn't going to work. If, for example, if Latesh is in the IT field and he goes with this dramatic arc story, bunch of techies, they're going to laugh at him and saying, what the hell is this? You're wasting our time. This guy must be from marketing. We didn't get somebody who's a technical person. And that's how they will react to it, because that type of story is not going to work with people who are looking for real content, real information. Now, remember, the people in the business setting tend to be very analytical, but the story you tell people that are analytically with analytical mindset is a different kind of story. It's a story where you have to kind of give them a scenario where they could see, oh, this could even apply to me. So what Steve Denning does is somewhat interesting. And if you listen to the speech closely, he tells this story about a guy from Zambia, right? And he needs some information, and he gets it from CDC. that is not even that's not a typical story that has that dramatic arc. This is almost like he's giving this is the guy who did this, and then he got this information, boom, that's it. There was not anything dramatic in that. The reason for that, at that time he didn't understand it, that this is a story that would work, and it did work. What he's trying to say to people who are at World Bank is that why is he not getting this information from World Bank? Why does he have to get to CDC to get this information that he's looking for on malaria, I believe, or something to do with something that he's looking for information? So the point he's trying to get across is that this story isn't a complete story that we're all used to when you think about a story, but it's just as effective, in fact, even more effective, because he's trying to get people from World Bank to see clearly, hey, yeah, that's interesting. Why is that information cannot be coming from World Bank? And that's what he wanted to do. That World Bank was sitting on boatload of information that should be available to people around the world, and somehow they need to create an initiative to make that happen. And that's when he came to the realization that in business, stories are also important, but it's not that simple. You can't just go in and give that traditional story. That traditional story may work for certain situations, but other situations, depending on the situation that you're dealing with, you have to craft a story that is going to resonate with the people so that it achieves your objective. And in this case, his objective was that he wanted them to see how World Bank could be in this picture that currently that they were not. And that's what the Steve Denning is trying to get across. So I think that what he's saying is that stories are important, but you got to do some work here. That you got to come up with the right kind of story so that it really resonates. It's not simple as like, hey, I'm just going to give a story where somebody just starts out with a problem, then he struggles, and then he figures it out, and then that may not work because people may not have time, and people are also suspicious of a well-told story, and especially in technical, where they want to know how did this problem occur, cause and effect type of situation, because that's how they see their world, and you better know that your story is going to resonate with them the way they think. So, Julie, do you have anything to add to this?
So, in terms of your speech, yeah, I mean, I think you're right that he used that story about Zambia as an example. Sorry, my phone just disconnected. My headpiece just disconnected. Yeah. Would you like me to go on to do my evaluation, or do you want to circle with the test first?
It's up to you. If you want to, if you just like, what's your comment on what Steve Denning had to say, and then we're just having a discussion. I mean, overall, I thought his speech was pretty good. The ending, I didn't kind of get that. I thought that was a little bit. He didn't need it. I didn't think so. But that's I'm gonna give him a pass on that. I just think that he could have just told it directly instead of using that little video that he had. But that was the only thing. Otherwise, I thought his speech was excellent. I liked. And again, it's a speech that had a lot of content in it. There's a lot there to understand. These are advanced speeches, by the way. These are not kind of speeches you can just watch it once and say, oh, I got everything. No, I mean, and it's somewhat difficult because there is a lot that's communicated in these speeches. These are very tight speeches. If you just like look at every minute of it, there's a lot that's being communicated in these speeches. These are not entertaining speeches. Entertaining speeches are not content rich. They're like content poor, entertainment rich. And these are not entertaining speeches. These are really content-rich speeches. So I just wanted to get your take on what he said and how he did with his speech.
Yeah, so yeah, I actually agree with you absolutely that these are very content-rich speeches. And sticking to my theme of transitioning in time, his introduction was very different than from Lisa's. He started out with an example of Al Gore, which is a negative experience. Al Gore lost the election because, first of all, he didn't know about stories. Then he got the wrong stories. But at the end, by 2006, he was the rock star of the speech world. You know, Emmys and Oscars and the Nobel Peace Prize. So he went on. At his transition point, that was about 2.5 minutes or 3 minutes. He started talking about himself. So he used Al Gore as the introduction. Then he used himself as a way to detail the speech. And finally, his conclusion was about 3 to 4 minutes, 3.5 to 4 minutes. And there he transitioned into the audience because he said, this is the little voice you hear inside your head. That little voice that says, I had to do this, I had to do that. So he went from remote to closer and closer connection. And then he started talking about why this is useful. But he underscored the basic message right at the beginning that good stories and leaders do not inspire you to change. They inspire you to want to change. And the conclusion, he says, in the beginning of the conclusion, he says, you want to adopt the idea. You want the audience to make that idea your own. I want to replace that little voice in your head with action items. So that's how he did the transition. And then his 4 main points are for leadership. So I think you're right that he talked to the community of business people, but I do believe that they work for personal leadership as well. And his points are, be true, but not just factual. Go deeper into authenticity, because he used the Titanic message where people could say 700 people safe, which are true in fact, but it's a misleading fact because many more people died. His second one was positive tone, where he says that the pleasure principle, which Lisa talked about greatly, is necessary for people to do that transformation. And then thirdly, keep it minimal, which is true, because that's how the message gets through. In fact, if you look at unresolved photograph digitally, there's no meaning at all. It is some kind of algorithm they use to simplify the message that human brain can take meaning. So in fact, we're taking 100% of the information when data is coming into our brain, but we only need about 5 to 10 or maybe even less to get meaning. So he wants to get to that 5 to 10%. And finally, as a way to do the leadership aspect, he says, for me, that's the most important aspect, is contrast before and after. But he did the introduction and the conclusion again in somewhere between a third and half the time. So it appears that for these kind of speeches in TED anyways, a lot of the time is used in setting up the message, getting the core idea, and then half of that time is used for the details, and then the final aspect to conclude it. And I agree with you, that video was very disorienting, but maybe that's his own marketing process. So that's what I have to say, is that I think, again, the time used for intro and conclusion comes up to somewhere between a third, and he made his conclusion very clear, and he had a very clear transitioning process.
Yeah, the thing about the video was that I don't think he needed that. That's what the whole thing was. It kind of distracted, because then that video was the conclusion. And what he's saying is that this is how you should tell that story, and he could have easily done that using hand gestures or his voice to convey that. I don't think he needed that music and all of that other stuff. It just, like you said, it it was disjointed, right? It was somewhat disjointed from what his main speech was. So, if Steve, are you listening? Next time, don't do a video. Just do a song and dance. Latesh?
Yeah, I agree, but I found that, see, but normally I don't know, like Jay, why you chose this particular video, because I was going through the other videos of Steve, and I found that this was relatively much better and much refined the way he was actually talking here. It was having a bit more structure, etc. And like, when you play a particular video on YouTube, when it ends, the second video automatically starts. So I thought, like, okay, let me go and listen to the second video also, which is playing anyway. So I found that when I checked the second and third videos, this was relatively much better talk, and I found this to be really a kind of the subject that he was mentioning and the way the story has to be told. Very compelling, and it really made me actually listen very actively. And for me, there are a lot of takeaways. One thing very important, I think, is like when we are actually, because nowadays it's been like a trend that you try to do a public speech or a talk by giving some stories. You want to actually relate to an incident, you want to narrate something, and that's how you want to grab the attention of the audience. But the key point here is that if the story is not true, or if the person is not able to bring out factuals properly, then the credibility is completely lost. So, and he mentions the example of how the number of people actually in the Titanic which sank, and then the count which he was giving was so incorrect. So, if there is some kind of a situation which happens in a real-time public talk, the moment you fat on the face, then I don't think the audience would really be interested in listening to you further, because they know that this guy doesn't have the facts properly. So then that itself closes the entire credibility to your talk. So that ends it there. But so when we are going to present some kind of a story, or when we are going to talk about some incident, make sure that it is really true, or if it is not true, then try to help it. I mean, just support it with a lot of facts and figures, and that would actually make it feel a bit more authentic. And of course, it should have a positive effect. And he mentions it very clearly that normally when we are watching a movie or we are reading a novel or anything like that, we try to have the ending to be happy. If we don't find the ending to be happy, we probably lose that kind of the feel-good factor. So it should bring out a positive effect when we are going to narrate something. And he mentions about the two types of listeners. That is, one, the people that you are seeing on the stage, and the other is the little voice in your head. So the new stories, it has to be like constantly you need to innovate and get the attention of both the audience as well as the little voice. Otherwise, the little voice will go here and, hey, why am I sitting here? Why is this guy talking about this? So he will go here and there. So you need to bring both the person whom we are seeing and the little voice also in sync. Minimalistic, cut down unnecessary talk, and just talk to the point that gives some kind of structure, and contrast feeling, which is like before and after, like what was the change that was seen. And contrary to what you and Julie had, Jay and Julie, that he ended up with that small video probably was not needed. But I found that was quite okay, because for me, when it was a more of I think the way he has been brought up. I mean, he had his work environment at World Bank, where he was more of completely into a corporate environment, and he is trying to sell a story to his upper management, so that they are able to take up the idea of having an information system in place. So when we have to communicate that idea, we may not have really the pleasure of having a lot of time to talk. It's just like a 3-minute speech that we gave, right? It's similar to that, or maybe an elevator speech. So it's like you need to communicate the ideas in maybe a minute or two or so. So at that point of time, if you are very crisp, you have these slides in place, and you are just going to give them facts and figures with proper structure, it gives an impact, and that curiosity factor gets risen. And once you plant that kind of a curiosity in the top management, probably from there the plant will, the idea will take a shape and it will start forming. So I think that's really, I found it to be like quite good, and it was a little bit different from the normal talks that we see. That's about it from my side. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let me comment on the video part. I think what he was trying to do, and again, it's not the video, it's just that that video belonged in that speech, and I don't want to make a big deal about it because it's not really that big a deal. I thought the video was really good. The thing is that there was no setup for that video. Basically, that video was summing up what he had already talked about as far as what Juliet pointed out with contrast before and after. And if you look at that video, that's what he's doing. Here's a company that did this, and here's a company that didn't do that. So there was that contrast that he was showing, and there was no setup for that video, saying that, listen, if you want to do a video where you want to try to convince somebody, here's an example of how you can do it in such a short amount of time. So that's it's like Julie said, it can't go too much like it's like a commercial for what he was doing as far as his business practice, consulting practice was concerned. That's the only issue I had. I didn't have any issue with the video as far as what the video was trying to show. The other point that I think you both pointed out, and I'll touch upon this a little bit more, that he doesn't really cover in this speech, but I've seen him when it's in writing. Story itself isn't as important as storytelling. And there is a distinction there. You can have a very good story, but as you pointed out, both of you pointed out, if it's not authentic, that story, people will sense it that you're a fake. And this happens in politics a lot, if you ever noticed, that all politicians have been told that you got to have a story, you got to have a story. But what they're sometimes missing is that they're just not that authentic. And in politics, where you're trying to convince people, authenticity is very hard for some people. And this is kind of reflected in polls. Like one of the things that right now, both in the United States, we're getting ready for the 2016 election, the two of the leading candidates are having problems, Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton. And these are highly qualified candidates. But the problem they're right now having is on authenticity. They are coming across like they're very well scripted. And that the reason why Donald Trump somehow seems to be doing so well is that he comes across as a very authentic, even though he's a total goof with some of the things that he says and does, but nevertheless, he's coming across as a very authentic person. And sometimes people want to believe you if you are authentic. So the point is, if you guys already know this, but if anybody's watching this, don't get hung up on, I got to come up with a real good story. Come up with your story so that you are authentic, because if you're not, that story is not going to help you. People will sense it, even though it could be you may sound great, you may hit the boxes, but it's still not going to work because people at the end want authentic. They don't want it to be, it can't come across as too perfect. So any last thoughts, Julie and Litesh? Julie?
Thank you. I appreciate that last story about being authentic.
Is that it? Anything else, or that's it? Oh, Julie, anything else? Okay, Litesh, do you want any last thoughts, or you're done?
I think this was a good way of actually showcasing how to do storytelling, especially in a corporate environment. When you need to be very short, very clear, and make an impact within the limited period of time. And from that angle, I think his experience dealing with the World Bank upper management and stuff, which gives a background of how we can actually win with an innovative idea and with the storytelling. If you combine both together, then probably you have a lethal weapon in your hand. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, we'll take a brief pause and move to our third segment. Okay, welcome back. This is Speech Talk Live, episode 17, and we're moving to the third segment. And in episode 17, we're focusing on just one theme, storytelling. And the next speech that we're going to use as a way to discuss this topic in a little bit more detail is how stories can be used to manipulate people. Even though we all agree stories are important, we all seem to understand, make sense out of things with a story. Tyler Cowen, who's an economist, a very famous economist here in the United States, and he talks about, I thought this was a very good speech. It's when you talk about content rich, there's so much he covers in this speech on why you should be suspicious of stories. And one thing that he agrees that stories are important, but sometimes the stories can be too good, and it leaves out a lot of, there's filter, right? He talks about the filter, and it can leave out a lot of the details that are also very important. So, you know, there are two things that we tend to do, the confirmation bias, where we'll, to support our hypothesis, we tend to look at the facts that support that and not the facts or information that contradicts that. And then there's a selection bias where we'll pick certain data that supports what we're doing and ignore the rest of it. So this is what sometimes stories tend to become, that they're too perfect. And I'll cite something that Steve Jobs had mentioned, and we did a theme on Steve Jobs where he says that you cannot connect the dots going forward, you can only connect them looking backwards. And that's what stories tend to be. Stories are dots that are really well connected. But in real life, that's not how it works. Because real life, you know, it's kind of messy. But once something happens, then we can create a story how everything fits well. But that's not how it happened. If it was like that, then everything would then you could be predicting the future pretty well too. But we tend to show with the stories how everything came together. But that's misleading, and it's also manipulative. But the reason that works is because our human brain, and this is something that Daniel Kahneman talks about in his book, where we use this, he calls this two systems, system one thinking and system two thinking. System one is like quick, we just get it, and it just, we don't confuse with more information. And sometimes these stories are so well structured, we immediately get it. Boom, this is how it makes sense. System two requires a lot of thought, and that's difficult, and we're not good at that because it's time consuming. A perfect example of this that I'll give you is just an example that I thought of, and this had to do with 1960 election between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And every time you will they talk about this election, they always tend to bring up that how Nixon lost because of his performance in the debate between John F. Kennedy. That was like the first time they actually ever had presidential debates. And that story is something that's been passed on now. It did happen, but it's not actually that factual. When you read the history that I've done, I've read quite a few books on that. Yes, JFK did have a very good debate performance, but it wasn't the debate that really won John F. Kennedy the election. There were a lot of other important issues that were important too, such as this, the civil rights, and that had more of a result. That was more of a reason why Nixon lost, because he was like kind of wishy-washy on that issue. He wasn't for it or against it. He was kind of stuck in the no man's land, and a lot of people got confused. And then when they get confused, they always go with the person that makes sense to them, and Kennedy made sense, saying, okay, at least he makes sense, whereas Nixon, they couldn't figure out where he stood on that issue. But that's not the narrative you get. The narrative you always get from the media is that it was because of that debate. And you and I know that one debate can't decide a presidential election. But it's a nice story. It fits, right? Because it's simple to explain. You don't have to explain, like, look at how much time I have to spend to explain why This was happened in 1960. I had already spent a couple of minutes trying to explain why it wasn't the debate, the reason why Nixon lost. So stories can simplify things. It doesn't require you to think a lot. And let's face it, what Tyler Cowen is saying is it's kind of the lazy man's approach to understanding of something. And sometimes that's not good. It could be used to really manipulate in your thinking. And that's what a lot of people do. That's why stories, as I pointed out, can be used to do a lot of good things, but it could also be used to manipulate you and make you do bad things. And marketing knows this. And that's why sometimes they create these stories to make you buy when you actually don't even need to buy any items. Julie, any comments on this Tyler Cowen speech, and overall your thought on what he's saying as far as being suspicious of well-told story?
Yes, thank you, Jay. This is very interesting speech because I will use a couple of key points that he used. Actually, he didn't use them as key points, but I think that if we could dig a little deeper, which he invites us to do, is he used certain words like epistemological hovering and the word margins, and then he went into talk about that things becomes too fixated. So the core idea here, the margins, I don't know when he spoke, but it comes from the word of comes from the core. It feels like it comes from the core idea of complexity system theory, which the layman know as a chaos theory. Inside that chaos theory is a couple of ideas. One is that there are larger patterns in the larger system, but you can't see it until time goes forward. And the pattern, the brain can recognize it, but you can't predict it. So one of the common examples for that is the stock movements, right? You know it's going to go up and down. You can see it, but at point to point, you can't predict that. So that is a kind of messiness that he's talking about, right? That our life is beyond rational understanding. The other word that that he uses, so that actually taking his idea of margins further, is at the margins of major states like oceans and earth, in the intervening area where the two states meet, is the greatest opportunity for diversity and surprises and new openings, right? So the other idea that he talks about is the epistemological hovering. The word hovering is not making a commitment, right? Being open-minded, not being fixated. So his basic point is that you need to be suspicious of stories, because stories simplify the story, simplify your life, so that it tells a very story that our culture may want us to listen to. He says stories imposes an order on the what is naturally messy, what is messy in life. I would say, for my own understanding, that stories imposes an artificial order on the natural messy aspect and complex aspect of life. So what he's really inviting us to do is do a deep dive into the messiness of life, because the stories are too recipe oriented. And when we follow those stories, we're following somebody else's idea of what is good for us. He spent about 3.5 minutes on the introduction, and he spent about 4 minutes on the conclusion. Now, this is very interesting. That's actually, the number turns out to be, again, between a half and a third amount of the total time he used. So some of the speakers here use a little bit more time in the introduction, such as Lisa. She spent about 5 minutes on the introduction, and she only spent 2 minutes on the conclusion. But if you look at it, if you need to do a lot of introduction, you set people up, you can do a little less on the conclusion. So most of them use a little bit more than half of the body of the time to explain his point, to explain the point. So because he's coming from this place of epistemological hovering, he asks us not to avoid stories because it is hard, to use Lisa's term, it is hardwired in us. But look deeper, look into the opportunity cost. Like if you're committing to the story, what are you missing out in your life? And the unintended consequences. Don't be too happy. The word he uses, happy, I may replace that with complacent or satisfied. So be suspicious, especially when you're really feeling good and getting triggered. Look into the opportunity cost, the new possibilities, and unintended consequences, and open into new possibilities by being suspicious. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that was excellent analysis of that speech. Latesh, your thoughts?
Yes. So I from me also, I think Julie, that was really nice, especially that what was that word you mentioned? Epistemological hovering. So that was like really a nice word for word.
I'm still trying to figure out what that means.
I just googled it out. Yeah, this particular talk about Twilight Women.
We need a story from Julie so that we understand what that word means. So Julie, that's your next 3-minute talk. Oh, sorry, let this.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So that's nice. So yeah, coming back to epistemological hovering. So Tyler Cowen, economist and writer, so he had come to tell us his species of stories. Suspicious is like he doesn't believe that stories are something that we need to really be believing in. Stories is not the right thing as far as he's concerned. So he says that there are 7 types of books that normally people write, and that was like a real takeaway for me because I never actually did that kind of research or a study to understand. So these are the 7 types of, or some types of books that people can write, from Christopher Brooks' book that he has actually mentioned about a monster story, a rags to riches story, a quest story, a voyage and travel story, comedy or humor, tragedy, and rebirth. So these are the 7 categories in which most of the stories that we, an average person, normally we tend to write about. We might do a mix and match of them, but then normally these are the 7 categories. So that was a great takeaway for me. And in terms of stories, he says that when he did a research, and as per that, and I think it was done, some university had conducted this research, and he was showing those findings there. And when someone was asked, like, how do you describe about life, majority of them say it's a mess. So from that, it seems like how we actually respond to this particular question. Why we have mentioned that life is a mess? That's because when we compare ourselves with others, then that's where we actually bring this particular comparison factor. So we always tend to compare and see, like, oh, my life, my lifestyle is somewhat not at level at what the other person is, our neighbor is, our friends are. So instead of doing that, probably we should be a bit more realistic. And the suspicion of being the stories influencing us is like we are biologically programmed to respond to stories. That's what he mentions there. Basically contains a lot of information. So when we actually listen to them, whether it's a fiction, non-fiction, there is a social connect that happens there. And people read. I mean, when they read novels, they read stories, and everything that we talk to them is normally in the form of some kind of a story. So the problem with stories is like when we live like a story, like a living narrative of a particular story, then we actually tend to be biased because we try to form or we try to go as per that particular narrative instead of living the way our life should be shaped. So instead of being bored by somebody else's experience or somebody else's story or somebody else's lifestyle, we should be looking at the way that we can shape ourselves instead of looking at others and then shaping our lifestyle accordingly. So, and he mentions it very nicely when he talks about how we stray away from the reality. Example, he says that we get out of the bed to start our day. We tell ourselves a story of self-deception. So he says that just maybe a mess of life. So he mentions that hey, I'm doing a great job. I'll be like really active at office. I'll have a wonderful team to work with. So we are probably, if you really like it, that's well and good. But if not, we are trying to deceive ourselves by giving this story to ourselves, by telling it ourselves. So yeah, it's going to be a great day for me. So that's like self-deception. That may not be the right thing to do in the long run if you're not really happy with what you're doing. So that the third way is that another way that he mentions is maybe the third point is about how outsiders manipulate us with stories. So that's more of the marketing gimmicks that people do, basically the advertisers, how they sell a story or they bundle it up with some kind of endorsement with the story. So that's how you actually tend to do the selling. So basically, the takeaway from this particular speech is that story is fundamental, and everybody likes to listen to stories. But and normally we tend to listen to stories which we like to listen, which influences us most. And people who really wants to change themselves, so people who are really interested in story, would be really interested in knowing much more details about it. But we should be more suspicious when we hear them, because this comes at an opportunity, cost of opportunity. So that's something that we need to really take in mind when we are listening to the stories, that we should not shape ourselves according to that. All right, so that's about from my side, Julie, and Jay, thanks.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway from this talk by Tyler Cowen is kind of pretty important. And what he's saying is that, yeah, we are all susceptible to a story, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But don't stop there. Go deeper, because most of the time we assume that if the story is so good that that has to be the truth. And that's not. It's a filter, right? Because somebody is controlling how that story is told. And I'll give you a perfect example, and something Julie and I can probably relate to, since I think we're a little bit over 30. And I watch these programs on TV, like 70s, 60s is a little late. I wasn't in this country in the 60s, so I can't relate to that. But I started watching this show, a show on CNN called the 70s, where they show you some of the things that happened in 70s. And I'm like totally blown away. I'm like, wait a second, I experienced all these things. They weren't that clean when that happened. Now the way they're describing it, when they put it into a story, it sounds like, wow, this was pretty interesting. I lived in a good time with these, or some bad time, where these things are happening, like the Watergate and all of these things. When they're happening, they're not that, like I said, when you're experiencing it, there's no real story. Another thing would be like sports. Like if you watch a live sports event, there's play after play after play after play. There's no story there. It's just happening, right? It's real time. But then if you ever go back, maybe a year later, or maybe even nowadays, not even a year later, could be in the evening, and they put a story together, and you're like, wow, that was an interesting game. And when you're watching it, you're like, there is no turning. Like, there's a big word in sports they always use, this was the turning point of the game. And I'm like, when you're watching a game live, you don't see like, you know what? This could be the turning point. Most likely you'll be wrong, because there is no turning point. But when this game is over, then everybody seems to know what the turning point of the game was. And it's like, I always find that interesting, that in a game there is no such thing as a turning point. It's a sequence of events that take place, and then at the end we put a story together, and the story in a sport has to have a turning point. So anyway, it's interesting that how a story gets better and better as there's more space there, more time. Your story gets even much more compelling. You get better at telling that same story. So Julie, any last thoughts? I think we got about 3 minutes left.
Yeah, I think it's really the common message is always stories are very powerful. They're hardwired into us. and we can use it as a tool to inspire people. Don't underestimate it, and also question the stories in your life that you get, and be open to new possibilities. That's what I got out of it.
Excellent, excellent summation there. Latesh, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I also feel that storytelling is something fundamental and it establishes connection with the people. But we need to be comfortable also with being messy life, whether it is, we need to be more agnostic, practical, and instead of living in a narrative. And he mentions it very clearly that we are here for a messy reason and not for a journey. I like the statement that he mentioned there. You are here for a messy reason, not for a journey. So live in the mess and be more practical. So that's the takeaway from this particular talk. Thank you.
Okay, that was good. I want to thank both Julie and Latesh for excellent discussion. I think we covered this in quite a bit of detail because I think stories are very important and they're all around us. And I think it helps to understand why you should tell stories, how you should construct a story, and how it applies in different situations. But at the same time, be aware of when you're receiving a story that there is a lot behind that story that you don't know. And even though a story can be very well told by a very good storyteller, but still you have to get a little deeper when it comes to making any kind of business decisions or even life decisions. So I think this was excellent. Any closing thoughts on the program before we call it quits? Okay, Julie liked it. Latesh, do you have a thumb?
Absolutely good.
There we go. We got the thumbs up. Okay. So this will be on YouTube. All right, guys. Thanks a lot because I think this thing gets cut off exactly at the broadcast starts. We can keep talking. Okay, guys. I'll see you next week. Thanks a lot for joining and participating.
Thank you.
It was a very good discussion.
Thank you.
All right. Bye,
you.
Julie.
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.
Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Bye. You too.
Bye.